Welcome to this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Today we're going to wrap up our preconditioning series and talk about what it takes to feed these calves and what that's going to mean for your bottom line. Maybe help you figure out what's the best way for you to see, is it worth it for you to take the time to precondition? As you get started, there's some questions you have to ask yourself. What's your break-even point going to be? What's your time worth? How much money do you need to make at the end of this deal for it to be worth it? For you to spend that extra 45 to 60 days, those initial inputs, to see it on the other side. The other question you have to ask yourself is, what can your facilities handle? Are you going to be feeding hay to these calves in more of a dry lot setting? Do you have a small pasture where you could even fence line wean? Maybe plant some winter annuals or summer annuals to graze these calves on, which could save you a little bit in hay costs. There's lots of other options that you have to slow down and think about to find out what's it going to be worth to you to take the time to precondition. That's the only way you can decide if what that number is at the bottom of the page is worth it for you to take the time to do this. Some basics to get started. You're looking at weaning these calves at a bare minimum of 45 days. Most places are going to ask for closer to 60 or maybe even 90. That's another thing you have to decide, is how long are you going to feed these calves for? These calves can roughly intake 1.5 to 2% of their body weight every day. Now, the first week after you wean them is going to be pretty stressful. Don't expect the number to be that high. After about 7 days, they get used to eating out of the feed bunk, they get used to what they have in front of them. We can expect that number to get closer to that 2% mark. The harder we want to push these calves, the higher that daily rate of gain is going to be, but also the more you're looking at spending in feed. Do you have pasture, or are you feeding hay? It's really important that that forage is at around 50% of their diet, and it's important that that's a quality forage. If we're pouring feed to these calves, but then you supplement that with a lower quality hay, they may not eat it. Their intake's going to drop, which also means that average daily gain is going to drop. It's so important that you take the time to do a hay test. It's going to cost you $18 per batch of hay, whether that's one field and one cutting, or if you're buying hay from a certain place. We're going to do a hay test. It's only $18, and it can help us to create a ration that's going to meet your goals, which is extremely important. The quality of feed and the quality of hay you're willing to put into these calves on the front end is going to directly correlate to what kind of performance you're going to have, or how many pounds you're going to gain, and that bottom line number is going to be. Some of the most common mistakes people make when they're preconditioning basically stems from not planning well enough. Are you planning time to vaccinate your calves to get that booster shot in and still be 14 days away from when you plan on selling them? Do you have time to castrate them, that they have time to be healed before you want to take them to the sale barn? The other thing is, what are you planning on feeding? Have you had your hay tested? Do you know what your feed is? Are you feeding enough feed? Those are all things that come in that planning period, making sure you know what those options are going to be. You have time to make a plan of how much you want to feed. Do you have a way to weigh these calves on the front end to see if they are actually reaching that daily rate of gain that you want them to? Another common mistake I see pretty regularly is people not handling vaccines correctly. When you pick those up, it's important that they travel with an ice pack, they stay in a cool, dark place. It's important that once we mix a modified live, we use it all that day. It doesn't get to go back in the fridge and wait for a week and then come out and be our booster vaccine again. And all these are things that are important to think about on the front end so that we can plan ahead and not make some of those common mistakes. As we start talking about feeds, the first question you got to ask yourself is, how do you plan on feeding? Do you like a traditional bagged feed that may come from the local co-op, or do you want more of a custom mix? We do have 3 local feed mills here in the county, as well as the Farmers Association Co-op in Malvern, so you have plenty of options to make the decision that works best for you. Some people may even choose to buy individual ingredients and mix them themselves. That's also a choice you have. The first thing you have to consider is how important your hay quality is. Your hay is going to make up around 50% of these calves' diets, sometimes less depending on where you want that price point to be. But having a high quality hay is crucial. This is an example of the hay test that we're going to use for our ration today. If you look at it, it's crude protein on a dry matter basis, which is what we use for evaluation, is at 9.3, which does make the cut for things we want to feed our growing calves. The next thing that's really important that we examine is our TDN. This one's at 54%. As we're feeding calves, we want that TDN to be over 50%. We also want to take intake into mind. When we first start weaning these calves, that first 5 to 7 days is going to be pretty rough. They're probably not going to eat as much. It's going to take them a little bit longer to get used to eating unless they were fed with a creep feeder, and then this may be a quicker process. After that initial period, once they're used to eating out of feed muck, that intake can start to skyrocket and we can really start to push these calves. Digestibility is really important. The lower the starch, the more digestible their other feed commodities are going to be. Some of the feed ingredients that are easier for those calves to digest are things like soy hulls, rice bran, or corn gluten feed. Another factor, we've talked about vaccinating, tagging, dehorning, and all of those things. We have to look at those costs that are associated. If you go with this program, this is an example of something that would work for the Go Green program. You've got $2 in a green tag. Your Alpha 7 is going to cost you around $1.20 a head, and we're going to booster that vaccine. Your Pyramid 5 plus Pre-Spawns, which does have that Menahyma hemolytica in it, it's going to cost you $4 a head with that booster included. This option goes with an injectable Cydectin or Dectomax. Comes out to be about $1.67 a head. And if you choose to go with a Ralgrow implant or another implant that's similar, that'd be another $1.60 a head, which would put that cost per calf right at over $15. Implants can be good options to increase your feed efficiency. If you have questions about those, don't ever hesitate to give us a call. If this is your very first time to do some of these things, there are other things that may come into factor. If you need to buy a tagging gun, if you want to buy a Newberry knife for castration, or you need to buy a dehorner because you've got some calves that have horns, those are all things that could be considered one-time costs. If you had to buy all of those one-time costs and vaccinate and deworm those 25 head of calves that we're using for this example, it's going to cost you $562.42 for just the shoot side of preconditioning. One thing that's important to consider as you're making these decisions is that this isn't your only option. If you don't like the Pyramid 5 with Pre-Spawns because it's a modified live and maybe that doesn't work for your herd, there are some killed options out there for that respiratory, and there are some MH vaccines available that can be done as well. If injectable wormers not an option for you, there are other options there as well. If you're trying to decide which option works best for your herd, give me a call and we can talk about all of those. The next question is going to be, what's feed going to cost? For this example, these calves are going to have access to free choice round hay. For the example hay test that we showed earlier, that hay is being sold at $25 a roll. Those rolls average 800 pounds apiece. Per that hay test, it is 9.3% protein and 54% TDN. For our feed example, for just this, we're going to use a calf ration that's done by Whitley Feeds here in the county. He charges $220 per ton. It's a mix of hominy, soy hull pellets, corn gluten, cottonseed hulls, and DDG. It's a 13% protein, 4% fat. So let's switch over to our calf ration balancer that you can download yourself. You can plug in whatever you need to, and you can start to find some of these numbers. So let's switch there for just a second. This is an example of the cattle grower ration balancer that you can download. The link's at the end of this presentation. Or if you ever have questions and are trying to use this, don't hesitate to give me a call. The first thing you're going to plug in is a little bit of information about your calves. For this example, we have 25 steer calves. We're going to start weaning them on September the 1st. These are 7-month-old calves that weigh around 550 as an average. Their body condition's a 5. Their breed type, these are mostly English Continental. These are actually Sim Angus calves. So we estimate at full growth, they'll be 1,250 pounds. We're going to feed these calves for 60 days. For this example, our goal is 2 pounds a day for their average daily gain. So we would end up with about a 670-pound calf. We are going to use a growth implant. Ionophores are another option. If you want to do a feed through that has something like Rumensin or Bovatac, those can really be a good option to help with the health of your calves. For this example, we're not going to include that. Once we have our calf info loaded into the ration balancer, the next thing we do is go to our ration formulation. The first thing we're going to do is figure out what our feed's going to be. You can go over to this feeds list and you can search through some of commodities. There's distillers grains, there's feeds. If you don't have a hay test on your hay, even though we always strongly recommend a hay test, there are some average hay and some average pasture options you can plug in. As you can see, there's also blanks. I plugged in a blank as Hot Spring County hay example, and I put in all that information that came from our hay test so that we can have a more exact number there. So we'll go back to that formulation. I know that our hay example is feed number 130. Our other feed example that we're using is the Whitley's calf ration, which is number 437. It's going to plug right in. The next thing is, how much do we want to feed of each? We're going to start with a 70% hay, 30% feed. When we go to the price per hundredweight, it's important that we slow down and remember what it's going to cost to feed. This does formulate in hundredweight. So we're going to take that $25 800-pound roll, and we're going to find that price in hundredweight. That comes out to be $3.13 per hundredweight. Then we'll do the same thing with our calf ration. That calf ration costs $220 a ton, which comes out to be right at $11 per hundredweight. So if we're feeding a 70% diet of hay and a 30% diet of feed, that's only going to give us 1.5 pounds per day in our average daily gain. That's not as high as we really wanted to go. So let's try flipping these numbers. If we go to a 70% feed and only 30% hay, now we can jump that number up to close to 2.5. But one thing to notice is this line right below it, the as fed feed cost. To reach that almost 2.5 pound mark, it's costing us 56 cents a pound. Whereas before, we were paying almost 60 cents a pound. So maybe it might be more price efficient to have a higher daily rate of gain. So let's shoot for somewhere in the middle. If we do 50-50, now we're achieving our 2 pounds a day daily gain, and it's costing us about 58 cents per pound. When you come over to the last tab, it shows you your feed blends. This is going to show you that you're going to be feeding about 8 pounds per head per day. That way you have an idea of how much feed you need to feed to achieve that 2 pounds a day rate of daily gain. So when we come back to our PowerPoint slide, this is just a summary of the information that came off of that ration balancer. So we're looking at our total cost for average daily gain per pound. If we shoot for that 50-50, it's going to cost us around 58 cents per pound. The higher our ration, the cheaper that's going to be. But at the end of the day, we can look at how many pounds we're going to gain in that 60 days, what that cost is going to be per head to achieve that goal, and what our feed's going to cost at the end of the day, depending how much hay we want to feed compared to how much feed we want to feed. And this is one of those decisions you have to make as a producer. Where in that is it more profitable for you to go ahead and do that? Let's take a minute and see what that bottom line is going to mean to you as a producer. So we're going to take this example of 25 weaned calves. We pulled these steers on September 1st with a plan to sell them 60 days later, which would be after October 31st. According to the Arkansas Market Report, on September 1st that week, the average 505 to 545 pound calf sold for $129.44 a hundredweight. Fast forward to this week's market report, and this week our value added, which is where these calves would fall, 650 to 695 pound calves brought $130.82 a hundredweight. So as we go down, if we had sold those calves on September 1st when we weaned them, this would be our average original price we could have gotten going off that average market report, which isn't a bad day. Let's slow down and look at what we had to do. We spent $391 on chute side. If we go for that 2 pounds a day of daily rate of gain, we had about $1,725 in feed, which meant on the front end to precondition these calves, we had to spend around $2,100. If we were a first timer that had to have all those other initial inputs, we would have been spending closer to $2,300. So let's fast forward. We sold those calves the week of November 1st, and they brought $130.82 per hundredweight. We hit a little over 16,000 pounds in calves.
which meant we brought in almost $22,000, which is about $4,100 more than what we would have if we'd sold September 1st. Which means even if we had those initial costs, you're still bringing in about $1,800 more than what you would have if you'd sold September 1st. That also means that you had some costs on the front end, and that does not account for your time and labor. And that's one of those things that only you can put a value on. The other side of that coin is if you decided to go for a Rumensin or a Bovatech option, that could increase your prices a little bit, and you could have some other things in play there. But at the end of the day, you're the one that has to determine what that bottom line has to be for you to be worth the extra 60 days. If you can make an extra $2,000 on 25 head, what happens if you're selling 50 head or 100 head? If you need help calculating these numbers or trying to make the decision if this would be effective for you, don't hesitate to give me a call. For more information, you can always check out our uex.edu/Go Green program for information on preconditioning. If you're looking for that calf ration balancer, you can find it at our nutrition or feeding site. Or if you have questions, just give us a call at the office. I'm always more than happy to walk you through any of this.
Thank you for joining us for this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about replacement heifers. See you next Friday.